Welcome everyone to today's panel discussion, The Role of Business in Democracy. My name is Jenna Dresner. I am the Senior Director of Growth and Impact at Citizen Data, and I'll be hosting and moderating today's panel. A quick note that today's conversation is public and being recorded. The recording will be available after the event. During the conversation, at any point, you can drop any questions you have into the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to them during or towards the end of the panel. We are here today to talk about the state of democracy, the risks that businesses can pose, and the opportunities and importance of businesses to prioritize and invest in things like voting rights, election trust, redistricting, and other critical aspects of our democracy. For those of you who don't know Citizen Data, we are a nonpartisan data insights and tools company for democracy. We work with partners looking to transcend differences, improve lives, and drive sustainable policy solutions for a stronger and more responsive democracy. We're hosting this panel discussion today because a more responsive democracy relies on multiple spheres of influence, the quality of our economy, businesses, and financial wellness being critical ones. Today, we'll start by hearing from Citizens Behavioral Research Director, who will align today's conversation around some of our foundational research. And then we'll be speaking with experts who work at this critical cross-section of democracy and business from Leadership Now Project, Urban Institute, and Microsoft, as well as Citizen Data. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Marie Stanforth, Citizens Data's Behavioral Research Director, to share some research.
Thanks, Jenna, and hi, everyone. Really excited to be here today and excited for the panelist discussion later. So without further ado, let's dig in. We're first going to start off with some high-level findings on Americans' current attitudes towards democracy. So to start off with then, there's widespread dissatisfaction with democracy. So you can see here that almost half of Americans, 46%, are dissatisfied with democracy. Just 1 in 3 Americans, 36%, are satisfied. And that dissatisfaction is something that runs really deep, and it's not limited to one particular party. Additionally, Americans are split over whether their democracy actually represents them. So 43% feel represented by American democracy, but at the same time, 42% do not. In particular, women, Black Americans, nonpartisan independents, those with less education, and middle-aged Americans feel the least represented. When we asked why in our qualitative free response questions, the key themes were exclusion. So whether that was racial, class, or gender exclusion. In its current form, then, democracy is just not working for a large number of citizens, employees, and consumers in America. When we dig in further and we explore which areas Americans perceive to be the biggest threats to democracy, we see that the influence of money in politics rises to the top, with 3/4 of Americans rating this as a 7 out of 10 threat level or higher, where the scale is 0 to 10. This is deemed such a significant threat that 41% of Americans rated this the full 10 out of 10, where 10 means an extreme threat to democracy. Political polarization and political violence are also top concerns for people, and these issues surpassed other concerns that we tested, such as illegitimate elections and voter fraud. So knowing that Americans are dissatisfied and feeling unrepresented, and also concerned about various threats to democracy, we wanted to explore their feelings in more depth. As we see here, the plurality, or 33%, as depicted by the bright red section of the pie chart, are frustrated by American society. But there are a couple of important call-outs when it comes to thinking about opportunities for change. So the first is that 1 in 5 Americans, or 20%, feel either energized or optimistic when it comes to thinking about American society. These are Americans, employees, consumers who will support and show up for democracy. And secondly, if you look at that gray slice at the top of the pie chart, that 3%, that represents people who feel uninterested towards American society. So just 3% express a disinterest. This tells us that while there is work to do to address the feelings of frustration and despair that people feel, Americans are still engaged. These strong feelings are a real sign that people aren't indifferent and they're not apathetic. And we can use these emotions to reach people, to mobilize them, and in some cases, even to move them. So during a round of focus group research, we really wanted to delve into these feelings even more deeply. We facilitated conversations with Americans on both the left and the right of the political spectrum about their attitudes towards democracy specifically. Both sides expressed concern that we're losing democracy, and that made them feel sad, it made them feel scared. So you can see at the top here, this quote from a Democrat who says, "I think we're moving more and more away from democracy, and it scares me." Underneath that, there's a Republican leaner who says, "I love democracy personally. I want to keep it, but I do think it's slipping out of our hands." So the key thing here is that both Republicans and Democrats, while unhappy with the way that democracy stands right now, deeply value it and do want to preserve it. We asked Americans about places where they feel comfortable having conversations about issues that they care about. As you can see here depicted by the orange line, places of work came behind other spaces like places of worship, neighborhoods, and community groups, but they also came ahead of venues like schools, sports groups, and veterans groups. So this shows an opportunity for business and workplaces to play a key role in supporting and strengthening the pro-democracy movement. Important conversations might naturally happen in the workplace. So if a business can provide a positive example that can help ensure that those conversations have positive framing and reinforcement, that could be really, really powerful. So now that we've looked briefly at spaces, we need to know who we can rely on to help us take action in support of democracy. Here at Citizen, we segmented the American electorate into 3 camps. Our democracy defenders, making up 21% of the American population in green, democracy shifters in yellow, and our democracy inhibitors in red. And our democracy defenders consist of Americans, employees, and consumers who are willing to show up for democracy. They're defined by 2 key characteristics. 1, they deeply trust in institutions, and 2, they are ready to take action to preserve and strengthen democracy. So you can see here that they have a respect and a curiosity for the other side. They have high trust in political institutions and objective news sources, and they're willing to help reduce division. They could be key players in helping to address issues such as dissatisfaction and money in politics. And with that, thank you so much for your time today. I'll pass it back to Jenna to introduce today's exciting conversation.
Thank you, Marie. With those findings under our belt, I am excited to kick off our panel discussion as we talk about how business community can best support democracy in the important and potentially contentious years to come. This panel will take us through the remainder of our time, so I will remind you all again as we progress through the conversation. Please drop any questions you have into the Q&A function. We'll try to get to them during or towards the end of the panel. With that, I will start by introducing our panel. We are honored to be joined by many leading experts in the field. First, Daniella Ballou-Aares, founder and CEO of Leadership Now Project, a national membership organization of business and thought leaders committed to fixing American democracy. Next, Elizabeth Doty, Director of Corporate Political Responsibility Taskforce at the Urb Institute, which provides forums, foresights, and frameworks to help companies better align their political influences with their commitments to purpose, values, stakeholders, and sustainability. Third, Mindy Finn, founder and CEO of Citizen Data, as I mentioned before, a nonpartisan data insights tools company that she founded to improve the state of politics, polarization, and voting for a stronger and more resilient democracy. And last but not least, Dave Leichtman, the Director of Corporate Civic Responsibility at Microsoft. As part of the company's Democracy Forward program, Dave runs civic engagement efforts and works with election officials worldwide to address tech and security needs. Now, I want to welcome all of our panelists and invite you all to come on video. We are so glad you all could be here, and I'd like to start this panel with a question for each of you, given your respective roles and relationships to the topic at hand. And I'd like to start with you, Mindy, by connecting the dots a bit between what we just heard from Marie and Citizen's research on various threats to democracy. And given some of these threats related to money in politics, dissatisfaction, and et cetera, in what ways do you see businesses to date as having posed a threat to democracy?
Well, I think first of all, business generally doesn't like government, and I think has generally taken democracy for granted. When you're operating a business, for the most part, government is seen as kind of a necessary nuisance that you have to deal with in terms of navigating regulations, in terms of ensuring that the environment that you need to do your business is optimal. The engagement with democracy has really been seen through, of course, if you're a business large enough or in an industry large enough, through the lens of lobbying for your interests or your customers' interests, your business interests, your employees' interests, et cetera. But in recent years, I think this has shifted. I mean, the fact of the matter is that American business needs American democracy as a stabilizing force. Our economy needs it as a stabilizing force in order to thrive, in order to sustain a free economic system. And I think one of the ways that, I think maybe it's a little harsh to say business poses a threat to democracy, but I think business poses a threat to democracy if business, and I know business we're generalizing, but if more broadly, the business community kind of sees themselves as just passive players in protecting and strengthening American democracy. The fact of the matter is that business really just doesn't have the luxury of doing that because as such an important part of our society. If you're a huge employer, you're delivering an important service or good that's critical. Particularly, we think of things like social media companies where there's a real, and media, a real impact on the civil discourse. You are a critical part of our democracy, and navigating this kind of world that we live in now, that is so highly polarized, where our democracy is so fragile, where we have, a growing number of the public who's expressing views that are really oppositional to democracy, who essentially not necessarily respecting kind of free and fair elections, beliefs that sort of lead to political violence and discord. At this particular time, it's really important for business not to stick their head in the sand, and instead to be really thoughtful and intentional about the role that they play and the behavior, how they act on that role, how they engage. Disengagement is, really not an option.
Yeah, thanks, Mindy. And I'd like to pull out something you said about, businesses frequently taking this sort of passive role. And I'm interested in you, Daniella, at the Leadership Now project. I know you often straddle this line between driving these pro-democracy campaigns while also educating and turning business leaders from passive to active. So I'd really love to hear a little bit more about how you all make this case to businesses. How do you use data and research to help businesses understand their role, and what role organizations like yours play in promoting this good data on the topic?
Great. No, thanks so much. And thanks for having me. I think our overall thesis has always been that there are many members of the business community who are concerned about the state of affairs, but who are not, don't have a clear path to engaging and taking leadership, and that we could provide that platform for that leadership. And that there's another segment who are maybe not as proactive as many of our members would be. We see our members as kind of the first movers, those who are most concerned, willing to engage. But there's a much broader audience, one layer beyond that, of those who, are somewhat concerned, don't necessarily fully see their role, are hesitant for some reason, and both the example of others who are willing to engage and better evidence and data on the impacts will be helpful in encouraging them to move. So I think as we've thought about those audiences, one of the things that we've done is really work with a set of academic institutions and other partners like Citizen Data to bring a clearer both fact base on what is happening on our democracy, credible sources to that, and really get our information and that content out there and the right messengers out there from within the business community through various channels, whether that's in the media, whether that's through briefings of MBA alumni networks, whether that's in existing MBA institutions. We have chapters now at Harvard Business School and MIT Business School of younger leaders who are our membership is largely existing executives and alumni, but we've been piloting bringing the student side in. So I think that grounding in academia, that grounding in data, that grounding in expertise is really valuable. And then you need to have both the networks of people that you can, who will make you feel more comfortable engaging and coming out on these issues. But I very much agree with Mindy's assessment that the institutionalized business engagement with politics, which I would say is a much narrower segment of the business community than is fully appreciated. I think a lot of times in politics is extremely narrow. It's tax and regulatory reduction focused. It goes through industry associations like in Washington, like the U.S. Chamber of Business Roundtable or others. And they have not been nearly as proactive on these issues as they should be when you look at the evidence of how business is genuinely impacted when democracies erode.
Thanks, Daniella. And You had mentioned example of others who are already willing to engage, and that sort of naturally brings me to Dave at Microsoft. And we all sort of know Microsoft as a company that walks the walk, so to speak. In recent years, Microsoft has been involved in a number of initiatives aimed at promoting democracy. And it makes me curious when democracy really became a priority. Could you tell us a little bit about some of these initiatives, why they came to be, and some of the impact that you've observed?
Absolutely. Thank you. So I represent our company's Democracy Forward initiative. And that started around 2018. And one of the main drivers for it was an increase in cyber attacks on democratic institutions worldwide. There are foreign malign forces at work trying to destabilize democratic institutions. It's to their benefit, right? And so that was kind of the driver for our companies standing up this work. We've always had for 30 plus years, we've had a fundamental rights pillar in our CSR work. Microsoft was one of the first companies in the world to grant same-sex partner benefits, for instance, right? You know, there are hard lines we take and stances we take that we've always took as a company. It's one of the reasons it makes me proud to work there. But fundamental rights also includes human rights. It includes democracy development, things like that. To get back to what Mindy was saying, though, this is something that Suzanne Spalding at CSIS started saying, and I love it. It's democracy is good for business. We know this. But business has to be good for democracy. It's only a fair trade, right? We fundamentally rely on democracy and democratic norms and institutions to do our business. Capitalism and democracy go hand in hand. It is necessary to have a stable regulatory environment in order for us to conduct operations. To wit, Google getting kicked out of Moscow last year is the perfect example, right? In a non-democratic society, the leadership of that country is free to kick a company out of their capital, right? Microsoft cannot be kicked out of Washington, D.C. We have regulations, we have rules about that, right? Oftentimes it's important for the operational stability of our companies to, I don't know, I mean, yes, it's antagonistic, right? We're constantly concerned about regulation, us doing business, us making money. But I'd say it's more important just that we know what the regulations are, right? If you look back to 2017 and US v. Microsoft, we actually dropped our suit in the Supreme Court once the Cloud Act was passed, because that was the goal of the lawsuit in the first place, right? It was just to know what the rules are. We wanted Congress to say, look, we don't want to fight with the courts about data requisitions. We just want to know what the rules are. Clearly, we wanted input on the creation of those rules, but we want to know what the rules are. And with the passage of the Cloud Act, we were able to drop that suit and say, okay, great, we know it. Let's move forward. I think that's kind of that's the underpinnings of all of this, right? Is that, but back to your original question, you know, tech companies played a role in the advancement of democracy destroying technologies. Maybe the social media companies a little more than the rest of us, but it has happened. We have to recognize it, and it's tantamount. We are responsible, so we need to step up, and we need to put resources towards shoring up those democratic institutions, or else, you know, we might find ourselves in similar situations to other countries and other operational environments.
Awesome. And I love that phrase. You had shared it earlier, that democracy is good for business. Now business needs to be good for democracy. And I'd love to turn this to Elizabeth, whose work is sort of cornerstone to this concept of making businesses good for democracy. Elizabeth, maybe you can tell folks a little bit more about the Urban Institute founding the Corporate Political Responsibility Taskforce, why it's important, what it means for business.
Oh, fantastic. And I love this idea. And I think underneath, many people have used this value on responsibility. I love that you just said that, Dave, that it's both a shared interest and an obligation, right? A premise of how capitalism and democracy work together, to think about responsibility. So I had actually been talking with Daniella for many years and Mindy for several years about what could we do to help business become more proactive and be able to say, these are the principles guiding us. And that the standard is not what's good for our shareholders, but it's actually what's responsible for the whole system working. And we started those conversations in 2018, 2019, and around the end of 2020, I think it was mid 2020, I met Tom Lyon at the Herb Institute, who had written an article called CSR Needs CPR. And it was a double entendre he meant, which is we can't really have social responsibility if businesses don't adopt corporate political responsibility. And so I asked him, would you like to connect with these leaders in the field? Microsoft had long been on record, Leadership Now's membership, the data from Citizen Data, that business had a role in strengthening these systems. And we said, we need a forum for companies to really wrestle with this. And what I love about this question, and Dave, I thought it came from you, Suzanne Spalding, the idea that it's two directional. I think a lot of business people have not thought about this field as often, as deeply as they have as the next product launch, the next technology. And their first reaction is, I'm concerned I'm going to jump in and help. Right? Just like we love people from home office will come in and help. And the first question ought to be the 5 whys. Why don't people trust their governments? Why are they dissatisfied with democracy? And what role do we have in that? And is there a way to shift it to a healthier base? So what we did with the Herb Institute, we started this task force. We tried to get business people together with the academics, with the stakeholder advisors, those who were championing this in their companies. We're now in conversation with some of the folks at Microsoft to say, what is it business can do to shift the base and what would allow them to be more proactive? And that's how we came up with the Herb Principles for Corporate Political Responsibility. These are just launched. We're in conversations with about 20 Fortune 100 companies to try and put a stake in the ground so that people know they can trust business as a positive impact on the democracy. And I want to call out a couple of conversations. Mindy, you mentioned this passive role. I've been in a number of conversations with government affairs folks who tend to think in the tax and regulatory terms. And they just have this light bulb moment where they say, I always go in and think about the political environment as exogenous. How do I adapt to it? And now they're having to say, how are we influencing it in aggregate, not any one company? So we came up with these principles. And the first one, ironically, speaks to a lot of the criticism from the right currently, that business is engaging in political activity that is illegitimate. So we came up with a principle for when is it legitimate for business to engage? And I can go into the content later. And then, what does it mean to be accountable? These are the commitments you've made that have people invest in you, work for you, buy from you, that they expect you to uphold, such as respect for gender equality or sexual orientation. And then lastly, what is responsible to the society, the market rules, democracy, informed civil discourse? Are we causing harm? What are we contributing to, especially around our political spending? What is our spending contributing to? And then, the last one is transparency. What do we need to disclose so people can know they can trust business, but also the government? So that's where we are at this point, trying to create principles that allow companies to be on record. Many of them are adopting these, acting on these, just haven't declared it in a shared way. And political spending policies come out of that.
Awesome. And Elizabeth, one of your principles is responsibility, and I want to focus on it because it's something that has come up in everything you all have shared. And it's also come up in a couple of questions in the Q&A already. When we talk a lot about the responsibility of businesses to democracy, there's an important question of how do businesses balance their responsibility to democracy with their responsibility to their shareholders, to the business side of things. And Daniella, you had started to answer it in the chat. I saw you shared some research. I wonder if you might want to start, and then I would love for everyone to weigh in.
About how we think about the risk factors?
Yeah. The responsibility of businesses to their shareholders and to democracy.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two related entry points, and I very much appreciate the bi-directional elements that are being discussed here, and kind of both the responsibility and that the kind of enlightened self-interest of a strong democracy is good for business. But I do think there is a perhaps even narrower lens that is can be a part of an entry point into the way businesses are looking at this, the way boards and investors are looking at, is that when you look at, I saw one of the questions in the chat was around when we talk about democracy, what specifically do we mean? Do we mean election reforms, right? Like ranked choice voting or objective redistricting? Are we talking about corporate political spending, transparency, et cetera, which I think are all part of it. But, you know, we know from the data that when you have elections that aren't trusted, when you have the possibility of political violence around elections, when you have the possibility of contested elections, and when you have political leaders that subvert, you know, the existing processes of the courts, exact political retribution on those who disagree with them, those are very kind of core signs of autocratic behavior that gets tracked around the world, right, by political scientists otherwise when you see. So I think, you know, we don't just have a problem of our system not functioning as well as it could. We do have some really very profound risks that if you're a board member, if you're an investor, those risk factors, you know, could really play out in very significant instability and uncertainty of the ability to operate. I think the arguments being made right now by those in the biotech industry that court in Texas invalidating a decision of the FDA is an example of that kind of uncertainty that's created for business and lack of clarity. So I think the risk, as much as I definitely agree that there is a non-trivial culture shift to be had around business seeing government as purely instrumental, as something to be mitigated, as opposed to, so I think that's really important work. But I do think even from just a pure hard-nosed risk perspective, we have some really tough things going on here. And sometimes that can be a useful entry point with boards and investors as well, to say we can't just ignore the risk factors to our core business that are being created by erosion of rule of law in our system.
Dave, I might open it up to you. I'm curious if you've ever had to make the case or how the case was made internally to invest in democracy-related efforts.
Sure. I mean, as I said before, we kind of consider it holistically with all of our fundamental rights efforts. Look, these people often think companies address this cynically and that CSR is done for marketing purposes. It is. That's not wrong, but that doesn't mean it can't be good too, right? Like I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't think I was actually having an impact in the space and I was actually able to use Microsoft's resources to advance the causes of democracy. But it also, you know, helps our marketing efforts. We call it our trust factor. You know, Microsoft is one of the most trusted companies and the trusted brands in the world. And part of that's because we do things like protect democracy, protect fundamental rights, protect the earth. Like those things accrue to our trust factor. And so it's actually kind of easy to make the case for doing this work. I'm always fascinated, and I saw this question in the chat. I mean, I hope you don't mind my bringing it up, but somebody was saying like, how do you connect the bottom line in it? It's fascinating to me right now that we are constantly attacked for, well, Xbox got attacked a few months ago for power saver mode, which by the way had been there for 3 years or something like that. But some right-wing talk radio show decided to drum it up and accuse Xbox of being like creating environmental culture warriors or whatever, or children. Cool. It's stuff like that that really like baffles me, because I mean, that's what our consumers want, right? Like environmentalism is actually what our consumers want. Respect for human rights is actually what our consumers are asking for. And then to have people who claim to champion free market exercise and then come after us for wanting to do what our customers want, it's a very like difficult thing for me to wrap my head around. But it really, like, if you go to I don't have the exact number, but the Edelman report from a few years ago says that like millennials and younger, I think 75+% of millennials and younger demand this kind of work from the brands they buy from, and they preferentially will will utilize those brands. Similarly, the employees of look, the tech companies are some of the biggest employers in the country at this point, right? Microsoft employs something like 200,000 people, which is the size of a small city. And our employees want us to do this. They demand it. 85%, I think, in the Edelman report, it's something like that, maybe 82% of employees demand that we do this work in order to stay at the company and work and be happy at the company. I mean, you take that together with other factors like, the employer is actually the most trusted thing in most people's lives from that Edelman report. It's a no-brainer to do this kind of work.
Yeah, and thinking about no-brainer, Elizabeth, you obviously do the work of trying to get businesses to sign on to these principles. Do you run into challenges, or do you find the same experience that it's relatively easy to get people to sign on to the concept?
I think the challenge right now is for companies to go public with what they agree with privately. We have had no objections to the content of these principles, and companies wanting to act on them. They actually find them hard. And I think the difference between this long-term approach on supporting fundamental rights and democracy versus the acuteness of the risks that Daniella is pointing to, it means that you are facing a much higher stakes decision right now, right? And it's only going to get harder. We'll have fewer degrees of freedom as power is consolidated. So I think what companies are looking for right now is a tipping point to say, this is the next Zicklin index. This is the next Freedom House index, to say this is what we agree on. And so far we have had no one object to the content of supporting and protecting democracy, eligible access for all eligible participants, transparent and effective institutions that are trusted. I will say there's one element here in the data that we haven't discussed that I think businesses could go on record and solve some of the distrust right away. And that is this feeling of exclusion and not being represented in decisions that affect the economy and people's sense of opportunity and jobs and prosperity. And there's a big distinction between companies lobbying for regulations that align profit with public interest versus classic economic rent seeking, which would be reducing value to society or to workers in order for the company to do well. I think companies need to go on record around that as well, and that will affect the trust in democracy and representation.
Mindy, were you going to chime
in? To weigh in on this point in terms of what companies can do and how do they navigate the risks around that. I think first of all, there are some key things that are just fundamental, and that's in these principles. They're represented in these principles Elizabeth's talking about, that they've created around access to voting and respecting free and fair elections. And there's some things that are core. There are also really bright lines. I mean, we saw a bright line around January 6th, which I think took some of the business community, by surprise, and thanks to Daniella and others who really helped organize some collective speaking out on that, so that other businesses would feel they were not out there standing alone. And there was a bit of a permission window to come out together in making strong stances on things like not supporting or giving to candidates who denied the legitimacy of the election. Businesses did say those things. They have since backtracked, which is why we see some of the challenges that our businesses face in making such stances. Nonetheless, I think continuing to pay attention to bright lines and encouraging and creating more support structures for business to come out collectively so they are protected when they take stances on those bright lines. But there's also, I think we tend to think about some of the institutional reforms or democracy reforms, whether it's things like certain voting laws or ranked choice voting or final five voting, those kinds of things. I do think there certainly is a role for business to play in taking a stance on some of those issues, and some have started to do this. And in order to get businesses more comfortable, it's important for advocates on those issues to keep those movements nonpartisan. and to focus on the real nonpartisan benefits. So I think about something like the nonpartisan primaries that are really aimed at, for some people, like truly nonpartisan, just aimed at creating more competition and vibrancy in the system, giving voters more choice and more voice. Business will feel more comfortable getting behind those things to the extent that they're not overly politicized by one party or claimed by one party at the other. So I think there's a role certainly to play for advocates too, to get business more comfortable. And then finally, I would say, it's not just sort of these core, like we call like pure democracy issues for business to speak out on around elections and voting, but there's a lot that business can do to strengthen democracy, and that they do. Things like investing in more, belonging and community and people feeling actualized and they have a living, being able to get along with each other are such key pieces of a democracy, and businesses can foster and do foster those things every day. So investing in more, apprenticeship programs and job retraining and community college support so that people do not feel so dissatisfied and left out of a system is contributing to a stronger democracy. And obviously business can do that. Keeping workplaces where there is, people feel that, not that politics should be brought into the workplace, but that everyone can coexist and work together, even if they don't share the same political beliefs, but they're united around this belonging to their workplace. So there are a lot of things beyond just pure democracy issues that business can do that are less fraught and high risk for them, and undoubtedly contribute to their bottom line at the same time.
Yeah, and there was a question in the chat about specific areas within democracy that we want businesses to be more vocal and supportive, and I think you really started to capture that. And I'd also like to turn to another question in the chat, with 5 or 6 minutes left of the panel, and I might start and pose it to you, Daniella, from Kristen Hansen. When I talk to government affairs folks in many companies and industries, especially finance, they seem to be playing the old game that still focuses on lobbying, schmoozing, and hedging bets by donating them to both parties. They seem oblivious largely to wider democratic erosion. They don't see it. And how do we change that?
Yeah, I don't think it's monolithic. I think we have seen some prominent investors and otherwise really, last year alone, we had JP Morgan come out with an assessment of democracy risk. We had Ray Dalio at Bridgewater kind of fairly significantly kind of speak to it in his work. So it's not kind of totally absent from the finance community. We see a lot of our members are in finance, but I do understand that there is still plenty who are kind of not worrying about it nearly as much as they can and not taking action. So I think we see a couple of paths here. We have an effort that we've undertaken at Leadership Now to really look at, to build guidance for investors in terms of how to look at these risks, and boards as well, right? And how do you really kind of assess the risk factors, create a framework for it, identify the actions that you can take forward, and then also use that to have kind of prominent voices on the investor side about what's happening. And then the other piece of it is continuing to have both the academic analysis on the market impact out there. I think every market's different. In countries like England and most recently in Israel, as there's been kind of democracy threats, you see the markets get impacted fairly significantly. The US has more of this kind of protection from some of that, admittedly, because it is the kind of the market for many investors. But I do think those cases are still instructive when you look around the world, that ultimately investors lose. And we've seen that in many countries when democracy erodes and you get uncertainty. So I think we need to keep reinforcing the case. I think we need some more tools and data for investors to translate that into actions in their portfolios and be clear what it looks like. And then you need kind of prominent, social pressure as continue to in that community.
Thanks, Daniella. And because you mentioned other countries, we have another question in the chat that I'd like to pose to Dave. given I know you just spoke on a conference about this, but are other businesses and other democracies having these kinds of conversations?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is a worldwide issue, right? I'm actually going to, well, I'll say that we're multinational, right? As are all the other large tech companies. I'm actually going to Prague at the end of May for a meeting with all of the Eastern European election boards with all the big tech companies. And we're honestly just sitting down to say, how can we help you? What can we do? Do you need tech support? Do you need threat intel? Like what kind of things do you need to protect your elections? I think we just have to be doing more of that. We have to be devoting more resources to it. It's a big deal. While I have it though, I just want to say to something Danielle said before, and I think back to the US issue, this will not change. There's been a massive chilling effect in the last year or so on some of the work that we are able to do, the other tech companies are able to do. Look, we at least for the large tech companies, we know that certain forces, both parties, frankly, are out to regulate us on major things, and that's fine. We get that. Us pushing on certain issues like this in the lobbying sense, in the reform, like legislative reform sense, it's difficult for us, right? It's hard. But there's lots of other big companies in this country. It doesn't all have to be on the tech companies. And I think until BRT and the chamber really start moving on some of these issues, really start getting the CEOs involved in these large companies, and I'm talking finance, I'm talking retail, like they have to move on these things if we want to make a real impact. It can't all be on the tech companies.
With just a few minutes left, or Elizabeth, do you want to chime in on that?
Only if you have a second. I just want to talk about a resource for the oblivious or not aware or complacency concern. Can I speak to that for a moment? I just wanted to speak to, there are resources internally that having more cross-functional conversations internally can help bring those to life. I worry when things are thrown over the wall, as they are on so many other things inside companies around these questions to government affairs, and instead having the conversations with employee resource groups, with your sustainability teams, with your DEI teams, even the ESG looking at your double materiality and your outbound impacts on the world. That's where you're going to be targeted. So that's one thing to use. The other is to use calmer language and just use the data to say, what would it look like? How do we distinguish between hyperbole and real threats to democracy? And the third one is to do scenarios in advance. What would we be committed to? What would be that bright line that would move us into action before you hit it? And I think that's of the essence, because everything we're seeing, it's becoming more severe.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Elizabeth. And as we close out the panel, I would love to leave us in sort of a hopeful note. I'd also note that we're really just scratching the surface, and this conversation obviously must be ongoing, and we look forward to having these continued conversations. There are many questions in the chat that we will likely not get to today. Perhaps we can organize conversations after, so please reach out to the organizers of this event, and we will make sure we connect you with the right people or get your questions answered. But to end this panel amongst our leaders here, we've touched on it in a number of ways, and I'd love to just end with sort of a concise call to action with organizations who are kind of grappling with this themselves. For you all to just share in your perspective, what is the role and responsibility of businesses to democracy? And, Elizabeth, when you share, perhaps you can give us a call to action for the principles and everything that you have going on. And Mindy, maybe we'll start with you.
Apologize, I was on mute. Yeah, I mean, I think Daniella talked about this, that it's not a monolith. And so for every business, they really need to navigate what's going to make most sense for their business, like both kind of address their business interests and the same time kind of make an impact in our democracy and in civic life. As others have mentioned, for some of the larger financial institutions who are so integrated in our society, kind of doing their own kind of study and putting out impact reports on the intersection of business and democracy, make a whole lot of sense. For others, it's kind of more community engagement, whether it's giving employees time off to go vote. So it really, there are these kind of core principles that businesses can unite around, but for every business, they have their own set of considerations how to engage. I think the big message really is this, that trying to reject passivity, like that they can just take a passive role and this doesn't really impact them or matter, because ultimately it does.
Maybe Daniella, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah, look, there's a reason why the organization I lead is called Leadership Now Project, because I think we believe we're at a moment where, in order to navigate the transformation that we're having in our economy, our society, our politics at a very uncertain moment for many reasons, is going to require kind of transcendent leadership and leaders who are willing to be bold and do things differently. And our members are individuals from the business community, business people we do believe have some unique skills to bring to the table and also unique credibility. And so I think when I think about what business and business leaders can do, I do believe within the business community, there are a non-trivial number of leaders who can set the tone for how our society navigates this right now, not only for their peers and their employees, but in partnership with like-minded policy leaders and political leaders and nonprofit leaders, et cetera. So I think, my big message is that individual leaders are critical. And I think, there's a lot of enlightened self-interest for all of us to be part of making this democracy work.
Dave?
Well, I'll make a plug for an organization. I think a lot of, if you represent a company and you're on this call, please join the Civic Alliance. One of the greatest things I feel like I've done in my professional career was to help found this organization. When we started, it was 12 companies, mostly the tech companies and Starbucks. Now it's 1,200 companies. And it's a resource for educating your employees on civic engagement and voting. Look, everything, so many people spend most of their time at work, right? Like most of your waking hours during the week are spent at work. You have to engage your employees on these matters if you want them to act and be serious. And the easiest thing to do, the thing that is so nonpartisan and so fundamental, is just voting. Like, just educate your employees on voting. And the Civic Alliance can help do that.
Amazing. Elizabeth?
Great. Thank you. And I wholly support that. The playbook is really a good tool. I think I would say companies need to have the internal conversations now, and individual champions bring those to the companies. That's who starts it. And the questions should be, what are we contributing to with all the ways we engage? What would be responsible now in the current environment? What do we need to learn to do that? And then in particular, I would say, I would like to let people know we have contingent commitments from the next round of Fortune 100 companies to be that first 12 on the ERB principles for corporate political responsibility. I would love to have 3 more in the next couple of months and 10 before the fall, before we head into the elections. These are really reasonable, really palatable. And to Mindy's point, they're a thought process that you customize to your industry, to your commitments, to your purpose, to your employees' concerns and consumer concerns. But they do put you on record before you hit the crisis. So it doesn't look like pandering or capitulation when you have to take action.
Amazing. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you so much to all of our panelists and to our guests for staying a few minutes over. I will conclude today's panel. This was the role of business and democracy, or more aptly, the responsibility of business and democracy. We look forward to continuing this conversation, and you are welcome to get in touch with any of us at Citizen Data, and we will get you in touch with the right people. Thanks so much.